Imagine being wrongfully accused of a crime in front of your entire community by someone sworn to protect you. That's exactly what happens to Sarah Thompson, a bright 17-year-old who suddenly finds her world turned upside down after a tense confrontation with a local officer. What starts as a regular day at her family's grocery store spirals into a fight for justice that shakes her entire neighborhood. But as Sarah's story unfolds, she discovers she's not alone, and what she does next will inspire a movement no one saw coming. Will she find justice? How far will her community go to stand with her? Stick around to find out, and don't forget to comment your thoughts below. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an episode of stories like this one about courage, resilience, and the power of unity. It was an unusually warm autumn afternoon, the kind that hinted at the fading of summer, but clung to its lingering heat. The golden light of the sun streamed through the windows of Thompson's grocery, casting a soft glow on the rows of fresh produce that Sarah Thompson meticulously arranged. At 17, Sarah had a smile that seemed to lift the spirits of everyone who entered the store. Her father, Evan Thompson, often remarked that she was the heart of the place, though she brushed off his praise with a laugh. The store had been a fixture in the neighborhood for decades. Located at the corner of Maple Avenue, it wasn't just a business, it was the lifeblood of the community. Families came for their weekly groceries, elders stopped by for conversation, and children, always full of energy, dashed in and out, buying candy or begging for ice cream. Sarah loved it. Even though it was hard work, she never complained. Her parents had built this place from the ground up, and she took pride in being a part of it. As Sarah placed the last apples onto the shelf, she glanced at her phone. A notification reminded her of an important deadline, the college application for her dream school. The thought brought a wave of nervous excitement. She was determined to attend law school, not just for herself, but to make a difference for people who needed a voice. Her parents supported her dreams wholeheartedly, even if it meant leaving the small store behind. "You're going to do great things," her mother, Grace, often said, though it was always accompanied by a bittersweet smile. Her moment of reflection was interrupted by the soft tinkling of the bell above the store's door. Glancing up, Sarah saw Officer Nathan Blake walk in. Dressed in his usual crisp uniform, Blake's presence often brought a sense of unease to those around him. Known for his stern demeanor and hard-line approach, he wasn't exactly the most approachable figure in the neighborhood. Sarah had never had much interaction with him beyond polite nods, but something about his demeanor today felt different. Brushing off the discomfort, Sarah continued her tasks. She reminded herself that she had nothing to worry about. She hadn't done anything wrong. This was her family store, and she belonged here. As Sarah moved toward the back of the store to stock canned goods, she pulled out her phone to check a message from her mom. It was a quick text, reminding her to make sure the shelves were fully stocked for the after-school rush. With a smile, she slipped her phone into her pocket and returned to organizing the cans. Lost in thought, she didn't notice that Officer Blake had been watching her from the front of the store, his eyes following her every movement. "Stop right there!" came a sharp, commanding voice. Sarah froze, turning to see Blake standing at the edge of the aisle, his hand resting on his belt. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, confusion lacing her tone. "I saw you put something in your pocket," Blake stated, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Sarah blinked, taken aback. "It's just my phone," she explained, her voice steady but unsure. "I work here. My parents own the store." Blake's expression didn't change. "Empty your pockets. Now." Whispers began to spread among the customers as they noticed the confrontation. A tense silence filled the store. Sarah, her heart pounding, slowly pulled out her phone, holding it up for Blake to see. "I didn't take anything," she said softly, her voice wavering as the tension built. "I told you I work here." Blake took a step closer, his hand now gripping her wrist. "You're coming with me." "Let me go," Sarah exclaimed, panic rising in her chest as she struggled to pull away. "Dad." From the back of the store, Evan Thompson emerged, his face contorted in confusion and concern. "What's going on here?" "Your employee is being detained for suspected shoplifting," Blake replied coolly, not loosening his grip on Sarah. "She's not an employee," Evan said, his voice rising. "She's my daughter, and we own this store." Blake's expression remained rigid, his grip firm. "Step back," he warned, reaching for his handcuffs. Ignoring Evan's protests, Blake escorted Sarah out of the store, her heart pounding in her chest. The faces of the customers, once friendly and familiar, now blurred as tears stung her eyes. The ride to the police station was a blur of fear and disbelief. In the back of the patrol car, Sarah tried to steady her trembling hands. "Officer Blake, please listen," she pleaded, her voice barely audible. "This is all a misunderstanding." Blake glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his face unreadable. "Save it for the station," he said coldly, his words offering no comfort. The police station was a stark contrast to the warm familiarity of the grocery store. Harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting cold shadows across the processing room. Sarah sat in silence as she was fingerprinted, her cheeks damp with tears she hadn't even realized were falling. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. How had a simple day at work turned into this nightmare? "Empty your pockets," Blake ordered again, setting a small packet of gum and Sarah's phone on the table. He inspected them with a skeptical eye. "Where's the stolen merchandise?" "There isn't any," Sarah replied softly, her voice hollow. "I told you, I didn't take anything." Blake leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "Listen here. It's best if you cooperate. Things can get difficult otherwise." Before Sarah could respond, the door swung open, and Sergeant Olivia Daniels entered the room. She was older, with a non-nonsense air about her, and she immediately assessed the scene with a sharp gaze. "What's going on here?" Officer Blake Daniels asked, her voice calm but firm. "Caught her stealing from the grocery store on Maple," Blake replied, his expression tightening. Daniels frowned. "Isn't that the Thompson family's place?" She looked at Sarah, noticing her trembling hands and tear-streaked face. "Yes," Sarah said quickly. "Am their daughter?" "This is all a misunderstanding." Blake's frown deepened, and his jaw clenched, but before he could respond, the door opened again. Evan Thompson rushed into the room, his face etched with worry and anger. "Sarah, are you okay?" "Sir, you can't be in here," Blake barked, his voice laced with irritation. "Like hell I can't," Evan shot back, his tone brimming with rage. "That's my daughter, and you've wrongfully arrested her." Daniels raised a hand, trying to defuse the situation. "Everyone calms down. Let's sort this out." As the tension simmered, Blake stood rigid, his jaw clenched in frustration. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope seeing her father, but the weight of the ordeal still pressed heavily on her. The ride back home later felt surreal, as if everything had happened to someone else, and she was just watching it unfold from afar. Back at home, the Thompson family tried to return to some sense of normalcy, but the weight of what had happened hung over them like a storm cloud. Sarah sat curled up on the sofa, a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her mother, Grace, brought her a cup of tea, the warmth of the cup offering little comfort in the face of the cold, hard reality. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," Grace whispered, brushing a tear from Sarah's cheek. "This isn't right." "It's not your fault," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't believe it either." Across the room, Evan paced back and forth, his frustration evident. "This is unacceptable," he muttered. Blake had no right to do what he did. The next day, word of the incident had spread throughout the neighborhood. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers stopped by the store to offer their support. As the community rallied around the Thompsons, it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. Rumors began to circulate about Officer Blake's history of targeting teens, particularly young women. At a community meeting held at the local center, dozens of residents gathered to address what had happened. Emotions ran high as people shared their concerns, and several young women recounted unsettling encounters with Blake. Though none had filed formal complaints, the pattern of intimidation and harassment was undeniable. One young woman, Maya, stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I was walking home from school when Blake stopped me," she said. "He accused me of trespassing and threatened to arrest me unless I cooperated. I was terrified." The room fell silent as Maya's words hung in the air. Sarah listened, feeling a surge of determination. She wasn't alone. This was bigger than just her. "We can't let this continue," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We have to do something." Her father nodded in agreement. "We need to hold him accountable." The day after the community meeting, the Thompson household was buzzing with activity. The incident involving Sarah had become the talk of the town, spreading like wildfire through social media, local groups, and neighborhood conversations. People were outraged, and support poured in from all sides. Yet, underneath the community's growing voice of solidarity, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of fear that nothing would change, that Officer Blake would continue to abuse his power. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee as she scrolled through the countless messages of support she'd received online. Despite the overwhelming encouragement, a part of her still felt small, still haunted by the look on Officer Blake's face when he had grabbed her. The memory of his cold, accusing eyes wouldn't leave her. Her father, Evan, walked in, his jaw set with determination. "We can't let him get away with this," he said, sitting down across from her. "It's time to go public with your story. More people need to know." Sarah looked up, meeting her father's eyes. She knew he was right, but the thought of reliving the experience in front of a camera made her stomach churn. "I'm not sure I'm ready," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they don't believe me?" Her mother, Grace, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "They will," she said softly. "This isn't just about you anymore, Sarah. Other people are counting on you. They need your voice." Sarah took a deep breath and nodded, her resolve hardening. If she didn't speak up, Blake's victims would remain silent, their voices drowned out by fear. She couldn't let that happen. Later that day, Sarah sat in front of a camera for a local news station, her heart pounding as the journalist asked her to recount the events leading up to her arrest. As she spoke, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. She told the truth, the whole truth about the wrongful accusation, the humiliation, and the fear she felt as she was taken away in handcuffs. "I never thought something like this could happen to me," she said, her voice firm but filled with emotion. "But it did, and I know I'm not the only one. No one should have to live in fear of the people who are supposed to protect us. This has to stop." Her words were broadcast across the city, and soon the story was picked up by larger news outlets. People from all walks of life reached out, expressing their outrage, their sympathy, and in some cases, sharing their own stories of similar encounters with Officer Blake. Sarah's bravery had opened the floodgates. The next morning, the Thompson family found themselves standing in the sterile, gray-walled lobby of the police department. A heavy silence hung in the air as they waited for their meeting with Detective Olivia Martinez, who had agreed to take their formal complaint against Officer Blake. Sarah's hands fidgeted in her lap, her mind racing with doubts. What if this went nowhere? What if nothing changed? Her father sat beside her, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. He had always been her rock, but even he seemed anxious today. Finally, Detective Martinez appeared, her expression serious but kind. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, Sarah," she greeted them, extending her hand. "I'm Olivia Martinez, head of internal affairs. Please follow me." The family was led into a small private conference room. As they sat down, Martinez wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. "We take accusations of misconduct very seriously," she said, folding her hands on the table. "I've reviewed your statement, Sarah, and I want you to know that we will conduct a thorough investigation." "But will anything actually change?" Sarah asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "I've heard stories from other people Officer Blake has harassed. This isn't the first time he's done something like this." Martinez hesitated, her eyes flicking down to the file in front of her. "We're aware of other complaints against Officer Blake," she admitted, "but I can't discuss those cases with you." Evan leaned forward, frustration clear in his voice. "How many complaints does it take before you act?" "I understand your concern," Martinez said calmly, "but these things take time. We need to gather evidence, conduct interviews, and follow protocol. I assure you we're committed to finding the truth." As the meeting ended, Sarah felt a mix of hope and apprehension. Martinez seemed sincere, but Sarah knew how easily the system could protect its own. Still, she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Officer Blake's conduct gained momentum. As the media continued to cover Sarah's story, more and more people came forward with their own accounts of Blake's behavior. A flood of testimonies, some shared anonymously online, painted a disturbing picture of a man who had abused his authority for years, targeting vulnerable individuals, especially young women and teens. One particularly shocking story came from Jenna, a 19-year-old who recounted a similar experience with Blake. She had been walking home from a late-night shift at a local diner when Blake pulled her over for suspicious behavior. Jenna had been terrified as Blake accused her of loitering, threatening to arrest her unless she handed over her ID. She complied out of fear, but the experience left her shaken. Jenna's story wasn't an isolated incident. Chris, a 16-year-old boy, came forward with his own story. Blake had stopped him and his friends while they were playing basketball at the local park, accusing them of trespassing. Chris described how Blake's tone had shifted from stern to threatening when they questioned him, and how the officer had forced them to leave the park. Each new account added weight to Sarah's story, and the investigation into Blake's conduct deepened. Detective Martinez, true to her word, began reaching out to these individuals, compiling evidence that suggested a clear pattern of abuse. Meanwhile, the growing public outrage was impossible to ignore. The community organized peaceful protests, gathering outside the police department with signs that read, "Justice for Sarah and hold Blake accountable." The neighborhood, once quiet and close-knit, was now alive with the energy of a movement demanding change. As Sarah watched the protests from the window of the store, she felt a surge of pride. Her community was standing up, not just for her, but for everyone who had suffered under Blake's authority. Yet, underneath it all, a knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. What if it wasn't enough? What if Blake walked away unscathed? That night, Sarah sat in her room scrolling through the messages on her phone. A notification caught her eye. Lila, her best friend, had sent her a long message. As Sarah read the words, her breath caught in her throat. Lila had been one of Blake's victims too. Lila's message was heartbreaking. She described how, several months ago, Blake had pulled her over for a minor traffic violation. What should have been a routine interaction had quickly escalated when Blake began questioning her about where she was going and why she was out so late. He had made her feel unsafe, his tone veering from professional to intimidating. Like so many others, Lila hadn't reported the incident. She hadn't thought anyone would believe her. The revelation hit Sarah hard. How had she not known Lila was her best friend, and yet she had kept this secret out of fear? Sarah's heart ached with guilt, anger, and sorrow. But it also strengthened her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Lila, for Jenna, for Chris, and for every other person who had been silenced by fear. The next morning, the largest protest yet was held in front of the police department. Hundreds of people gathered, their voices rising in unison as they called for Blake's arrest and systemic reform. The energy was electric, the crowd united in their demand for justice. Sarah stood at the front, her father by her side, holding a sign that read, "No more silence." As she looked out at the sea of faces, she felt a swell of pride and determination. This was the breaking point. The moment when the community, fed up with years of abuse, finally said enough. Suddenly, the crowd parted as Officer Blake himself appeared on the steps of the police department. His expression was unreadable, but the sight of him made Sarah's blood run cold. The tension in the air was palpable as the crowd watched him, waiting to see what he would do. Blake's eyes locked with Sarah's, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. Then, without a word, Blake turned and walked back into the building. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices filled with triumph. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The weeks that followed the large protest were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. The investigation into Officer Blake's conduct had finally gained serious traction. Detective Olivia Martinez worked tirelessly, interviewing victims and witnesses, collecting evidence, and compiling a case that revealed a disturbing pattern of abuse by Blake. He had used his position of authority to intimidate, manipulate, and terrorize those who were least likely to fight back: young women, teens, and minorities. Sarah felt a strange mix of hope and anxiety as she sat at the dinner table with her family one evening. The weight of the upcoming trial pressed heavily on her. The knowledge that she would soon be testifying against Blake, facing him again, was both empowering and terrifying. "I know it's hard," her father, Evan, said, breaking the silence. "But we've come this far. You're strong, Sarah." "We all are." Her mother, Grace, nodded in agreement. "We're with you, every step of the way. You're doing the right thing." Sarah smiled weakly, grateful for their support. But deep down, she knew that the trial would be grueling. Testifying in front of a courtroom full of people, recounting the day Blake wrongfully accused her, the day he humiliated her in front of everyone, she dreaded it. But she knew it was necessary, not just for her, but for everyone who had suffered under his abuse. The trial of Officer Nathan Blake was one of the most highly anticipated events in the city's recent history. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and advocates, all eager to witness justice being served. Blake, now formally charged with multiple counts of misconduct, including harassment, wrongful arrest, and abuse of power, sat at the defendant's table, his expression as cold and unreadable as ever. Sarah sat in the gallery, surrounded by her family and friends. Lila was there, gripping her hand tightly, offering silent support. Other victims, including Jenna and Chris, had also come to lend their voices to the case. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as the trial began. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case. Assistant District Attorney Monica Reynolds, a sharp and determined lawyer, took the lead. She presented evidence that painted a clear picture of Blake's abuse of power over the years, supported by testimonies from victims and witnesses who had been affected by his actions. One by one, people took the stand, recounting their experiences with Blake. Jenna's voice trembled as she described how Blake had threatened her for no reason other than walking home late at night. Chris spoke of the fear he felt when Blake had stopped him and his friends at the park, accusing them of trespassing on public property. Each story added another layer to the mountain of evidence against Blake, and the tension in the courtroom grew with every testimony. When it was finally Sarah's turn to take the stand, the weight of the moment nearly overwhelmed her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she made her way to the witness box, her hands shaking slightly. She glanced at Blake, who sat across from her, his expression as cold as ever. But she refused to be intimidated. Monica Reynolds approached the stand, her voice steady and supportive. "Sarah, can you tell the court about your encounter with Officer Blake on the day of your arrest?" Sarah took a deep breath and began to recount the events of that fateful day. She told the court how Blake had accused her of stealing in her own family store, how he had grabbed her wrist and arrested her in front of a crowd of people, how she had felt humiliated, scared, and powerless. Her voice wavered at times, but she remained steady, determined to tell her truth. As she spoke, she felt the eyes of the courtroom on her, watching, listening. The weight of the moment was heavy, but as she finished her testimony, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had done it. She had told her story. The defense, led by Richard Grayson, a lawyer known for his aggressive tactics, attempted to discredit Sarah and the other victims. He argued that Officer Blake had been following protocol, that the complaints against him were exaggerated or taken out of context. He questioned Sarah's credibility, trying to paint her as an emotional teenager who had overreacted. But Sarah held her ground, refusing to let him shake her. The trial continued for several more days, with both sides presenting their arguments. But as the evidence mounted, it became clear that Blake's actions were indefensible. The testimonies of the victims, combined with the documented complaints that had been ignored for years, painted a damning picture. When the closing arguments were made, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Monica Reynolds delivered a powerful final statement, reminding the jury that this case was not just about one officer's misconduct, was about justice for an entire community. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Each day felt like an eternity to Sarah and her family, who waited anxiously for the verdict. The entire city seemed to hold its breath, the trial having become a symbol of the broader issues of police misconduct and community justice. On the third day, the jury returned to the courtroom. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as they filed in, their expressions unreadable. She gripped her mother's hand tightly, her breath shallow as she waited for the foreperson to speak. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Nathan Blake, guilty on all counts." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. A wave of emotion swept through the gallery. Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of relief, her eyes welling with tears. Blake remained expressionless as the judge delivered his sentence, substantial prison term that would ensure he would never wear a badge again. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. The community gathered in solidarity, their voices united in celebration of the long-awaited justice. Reporters swarmed the scene, eager to capture the reactions of those who had been involved in the case. As Sarah stepped outside, she was greeted by a sea of faces, some familiar, some not, but all of them filled with gratitude and admiration. People came up to her, thanking her for her bravery, for standing up when so many others had stayed silent. "You did it," Lila said, wrapping Sarah in a tight hug. "We all did. I couldn't have done it without all of you," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. This was for everyone. The sense of relief and triumph was palpable, but there was also an understanding that the fight wasn't over. The conviction of one corrupt officer was a victory, but it was only the beginning of a larger movement for accountability and reform. In the weeks following the trial, the city began to heal. The police department, under intense scrutiny from the public and oversight agencies, implemented a series of reforms aimed at preventing future abuses of power. Mandatory bias training was introduced for all officers, and an independent oversight committee was established to review complaints against law enforcement. The changes were significant, but Sarah knew there was still more work to be done. As the dust settled, Sarah found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. She had been thrust into the spotlight, forced to confront her fears and stand up against an unjust system. But through it all, she had found her voice, and with it, a sense of purpose. One afternoon, as she walked through the neighborhood, she noticed the subtle but meaningful changes that had taken root. Officers patrolled the streets with greater respect for the community, and local businesses had begun working with city leaders to promote programs aimed at fostering trust between residents and law enforcement. There was a sense of hope in the air, a feeling that real progress had been made. At the grocery store, Sarah was greeted warmly by customers who had followed her journey. An elderly man, who had been a loyal patron of the store for years, approached her with a kind smile. "Thank you for what you did," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "You made a difference, Sarah." Her parents, Evan and Grace, stood nearby, watching their daughter with pride. "You've grown into an incredible young woman," her mother said softly. Sarah smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the support of her family and community. "It's because I have incredible people supporting me," she replied. Months later, at a community event celebrating local youth achievements, Sarah stood at the podium once more. The crowd before her was filled with familiar faces, people who had stood by her during the trial, people who had found their own courage in her story. "Our journey is far from over," she began, her voice strong and clear. "But together, we've shown that unity and courage can pave the way for change. We've proven that no one is above the law and that justice belongs to all of us." The audience erupted in applause, and as Sarah looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, all filled with admiration and hope, she felt a profound sense of purpose. The shadows that once loomed over her community had begun to recede, replaced by the collective light of resilience and hope. As the sun set over the rooftops, Sarah walked home, her heart light. The path ahead was still uncertain, but she was no longer afraid. Surrounded by a community that refused to be silenced, she knew they could face whatever came next. The echoes of their voices, demanding justice, insisting on dignity, would continue to ring out, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who stood together against injustice. In the weeks following Officer Blake's conviction, Sarah Thompson's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The storm that had once engulfed her and her family was beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet but palpable sense of relief. The trial was over and justice had been served, but Sarah knew the journey was far from complete. The grocery store had returned to its usual pace, bustling with customers who greeted Sarah and her family warmly, many stopping to thank her for her bravery. Some brought baked goods, others shared stories of their own experiences with the legal system, or expressed their gratitude for the change her actions had sparked. Still, Sarah struggled with the emotional weight of everything that had happened. While she was proud of the outcome and the reforms being implemented, there was a part of her that felt hollow, like a runner at the end of a marathon, too exhausted to celebrate the finish line. The emotional scars were deep, and the experience had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. One afternoon, as Sarah stocked shelves with her father, Evan, he paused and looked at her thoughtfully. "You've been quiet lately," he said gently, his eyes filled with concern. "How are you really doing?" Sarah shrugged, not meeting his gaze. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice too casual to be convincing. "Just tired, I guess." Evan set down a box of canned goods and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay to feel tired. You went through something that no one should ever have to experience. But you don't have to carry this burden alone." Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping as the weight of her emotions pressed down on her. I thought winning would feel different," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it'd feel lighter or free, but I still feel trapped by everything that happened." Evan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Healing takes time, Sarah. You've done something incredible, but that doesn't mean you have to be okay right away. We're here for you, no matter what." Sarah looked at her father, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had leaned on her family throughout the ordeal, and their support had been her anchor. But now, as the dust settled, she realized that healing was a process she had to go through on her own terms. That evening, as Sarah sat alone in her room, she opened her laptop and began searching for local support groups. She found one specifically for young people who had experienced trauma related to law enforcement and decided to attend a meeting. It wasn't easy, but Sarah knew she needed to take the next step toward healing. Attending the support group turned out to be one of the best decisions Sarah had made in a long time. The group was small but filled with people who had faced similar experiences, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like she wasn't alone. They talked about their fears, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. And slowly but surely, Sarah began to feel a sense of release, like the weight she had been carrying was finally beginning to lift. It wasn't long before Sarah found herself becoming an active member of the group, volunteering to help organize events and connecting with other advocacy organizations. Her story had resonated with so many people in her community, and now she was determined to make sure that no one else had to go through what she had. One day, as she was leaving a support group meeting, Sarah ran into Aisha, a young woman who had also testified against Blake. They had crossed paths briefly during the trial, but hadn't had a chance to talk since the verdict. Aisha called out, hurrying to catch up with her. "I'm glad I ran into you. I wanted to thank you for everything you did." Sarah smiled, surprised by the sudden rush of emotion. "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "We were all in this together." Aisha shook her head. "Maybe, but you were the one who had the courage to speak out first. You inspired all of us to stand up." The two stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Aisha's words sinking in. It was strange for Sarah to think of herself as someone who had inspired others. She had only been trying to survive. But as she looked around at the small group of people leaving the meeting, she realized that her actions had created a ripple effect. One person speaking out had led to dozens more finding their voices, and together they had brought about real change. "I'm thinking about going to law school," Aisha said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I want to help people, like you did." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Law school. It was something she had dreamed about for years, but the events of the past months had made her question everything. Could she still pursue that path after everything she had been through, or had her experience left her too scarred to continue? "I've been thinking about it too," Sarah admitted quietly, "but I'm not sure if I'm ready." Aisha smiled softly. Maybe none of us are ever really ready. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. The words struck a chord with Sarah, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of excitement at the thought of the future. Maybe Aisha was right. Maybe she wasn't ready yet, but that didn't mean she couldn't start working towards something better. In the months that followed, Sarah threw herself into advocacy work. She began volunteering with local organizations focused on social justice and police reform, working alongside other young people who had been affected by similar issues. Together, they organized community events, pushed for more transparency in law enforcement, and fought for policy changes at the local level. The grocery store became a hub of activity, with flyers for upcoming rallies and community meetings lining the windows. People from all walks of life came together, united by a common goal to make their community a safer, more just place for everyone. One afternoon, Sarah received a call from Detective Olivia Martinez, the Internal Affairs Officer who had helped with Blake's investigation. "Sarah, I just wanted to let you know that your case has made a real difference," Martinez said. "Because of the work you and others have done, the department is implementing new policies to ensure that complaints like yours are taken seriously." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a significant step in the right direction. The next big event in the community was a youth leadership conference, designed to recognize and celebrate young people who had made a positive impact on the neighborhood. Sarah had been asked to give the keynote address, a request that had both thrilled and terrified her. Standing in front of a crowd and speaking about her experience still felt daunting, but she knew how important it was to share her story. As the day of the conference arrived, Sarah stood backstage, nervously clutching her notes. She could hear the hum of the audience beyond the curtain, and her heart raced with anticipation. Her parents were sitting in the front row, along with Lila, Aisha, and other friends who had supported her throughout her journey. When it was time, Sarah stepped out onto the stage. The room fell silent as she approached the podium, the spotlight warm on her face. She took a deep breath and began. "When I was wrongfully accused and arrested, I felt powerless," she started, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I felt like my voice didn't matter. But I learned something important through that experience: our voices do matter. When we speak up, when we come together, we can create real, lasting change." She paused, scanning the faces of the young people in the audience. Many of them were looking up at her with admiration, but more importantly, with hope. Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of pride and purpose swell within her. "We've come a long way as a community," she continued, "but there's still work to be done. Our journey isn't over, and we can't afford to stop now. Together, we've proven that when we stand united, we can overcome anything." The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the walls. As Sarah stood there, basking in the collective energy of the crowd, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope for the future, hope for her community, and hope for herself. When the conference ended, Sarah stood with her family and friends, soaking in the joy and celebration around her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt ready to face it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the rooftops, Sarah walked home with her parents, her heart full. The challenges that lay ahead no longer felt insurmountable. She had her family, her friends, and a community that refused to be silenced. And most importantly, she had herself, the girl who had once been too afraid to speak out, but who now knew that her voice had the power to change the world. Thank you for your patience. We've reached the conclusion of Part 4, Justice and Healing, and wrapped up the primary plot threads of Sarah's journey. Since you're requesting more, we can explore additional content that expands on the themes, such as Sarah's ongoing efforts to advocate for systemic change or the aftermath of Officer Blake's conviction. We could also dive into Sarah's future, her education, and her role as a community leader. Here is an additional enriching continuation of the story, without violating YouTube policy or U.S. law. 1 year later, the quiet hum of the city on a cool autumn morning felt familiar, yet everything had changed. It had been a year since Officer Nathan Blake had been convicted. A year since Sarah's testimony, and the testimony of many others, had led to his downfall. A year since their community had come together in an unshakable display of solidarity, demanding justice. But it wasn't just about that moment anymore. For Sarah, the fight for justice had become her life's mission. As she sat in a small cafe near the courthouse, sipping her coffee and reviewing notes on her laptop, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known before. She had just started her second year of college, studying criminal justice and law. Her days were packed with classes, study sessions, and her part-time internship at a nonprofit legal clinic that provided support to victims of police misconduct. It was challenging work, but Sarah thrived in it. The cafe was bustling, but Sarah was focused, typing away at her latest research paper on community policing reforms. She had spent the past few months studying the legal system in greater depth, motivated by her own experiences and the desire to make real, lasting changes. The passion she had discovered during the fight against Officer Blake had only grown stronger. Her phone buzzed with a message from Lila, who was now working as a youth mentor at the community center. "You coming to the meeting tonight?" Lila's text read. "We could use your voice again." Sarah smiled as she replied, "Of course. Wouldn't miss it." The meeting Lila was referring to was part of an ongoing series of community discussions about police accountability, racial justice, and systemic reform. These meetings had been born out of the movement Sarah had helped start, and they were still going strong. The group had grown, now working closely with city officials and police leaders to push for more oversight, greater transparency, and fairer treatment of all residents. As she prepared to leave the cafe, Sarah glanced at the time. She had just enough time to head over to the legal clinic before the evening meeting. On her way out, she bumped into Detective Olivia Martinez, who was walking in for her afternoon coffee. "Sarah, good to see you," Martinez said warmly, her face lighting up with recognition. The two had kept in touch since Blake's trial, and Martinez had been instrumental in helping Sarah navigate the world of legal advocacy. "You too, Detective," Sarah replied with a smile. "How are things at the department?" Martinez sighed, but her expression remained positive. "Better. We've made progress, but there's still a long way to go. The Oversight Committee is in place, and we've started implementing bias training for all officers. It's not perfect, but it's a start." Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of pride in how far they had come. "It's good to hear. Well, keep pushing to make sure the changes stick." Martinez chuckled. "I don't doubt that for a second. You've become quite the force for change, you know." Sarah smiled modestly, but inside she felt the weight of those words. She had come a long way from the scared, uncertain girl who had been arrested in her family's grocery store. Now she was using her voice and her growing knowledge of the law to make a difference in ways she had never imagined. Later that evening, Sarah arrived at the community center for the meeting. The familiar faces of her friends and fellow activists greeted her as she walked in. Lila waved from the front of the room, where she was setting up the microphone for the speakers. The room buzzed with conversation as more people filtered in, ready to discuss the latest proposals for police accountability and reform. As the meeting began, Sarah found herself lost in thought, reflecting on how much had changed in the past year. Not just in the community, but in her own life. She had taken control of her future, and for the first time, she truly believed that her actions could make a difference on a larger scale. After a few speakers shared updates on ongoing projects, Lila took the microphone to introduce Sarah. "We're lucky to have Sarah here with us tonight," Lila said with a smile. "As many of you know, she's been a driving force in our fight for justice, and she's continuing that work as she studies law. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome her to the stage to share some exciting news." Sarah blinked in surprise as Lila handed her the microphone. She hadn't been expecting to speak, but she quickly composed herself. "Thanks, Lila," she began, her voice steady but warm. "I wasn't planning to make a big announcement tonight, but since Lila insists." The room chuckled softly, and Sarah smiled. "I wanted to share something that I've been working on with the legal clinic," she continued. We've just launched a new program that will offer free legal services to young people in our community who have been wrongfully targeted by law enforcement. This is something I'm really passionate about because I know how important it is to have legal representation when you feel powerless. There was a murmur of approval from the crowd, and Sarah continued, her confidence growing. This program is just the beginning. I'm also working on a proposal to expand community-based policing programs here in our city programs that encourage officers to build relationships with the neighborhoods they serve instead of using fear and intimidation. Applause broke out, and Sarah felt a rush of pride. This was the path she had chosen, and she was determined to see it through. The fight wasn't over, but they were making real progress together. The months passed quickly, filled with new challenges, victories, and setbacks. But through it all, Sarah remained committed to the cause. She balanced her studies with her work at the legal clinic and continued to attend community meetings, advocating for changes that would benefit future generations. One afternoon, as Sarah prepared for another community event, she received a message from Aisha, the young woman who had testified against Officer Blake. Aisha had recently graduated from high school and had been accepted to college, where she planned to study social work. "Hey Sarah," the message read, "I just wanted to let you know that I got into my top choice college I'm starting next semester, and I'll be studying social work, just like we talked about. You've inspired me more than you know, and I can't wait to start helping others, just like you've helped me." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. It was moments like this that reminded her why she had chosen this path. She had fought for herself, yes, but she had also fought for people like Aisha, those who needed someone to believe in them, someone to stand up and say, "Enough is enough." At the event that evening, Sarah once again found herself standing before a crowd of young people, many of them looking to her for guidance and inspiration. She spoke from the heart, sharing not just her experiences, but her hopes for the future. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "But our work isn't done. We are the next generation of leaders, and it's up to us to keep pushing for change. We can't be silent. We can't give up. Together, we can build a better future for all of us." The applause was thunderous, and as Sarah stepped down from the stage, she felt a profound sense of purpose. She wasn't just a survivor of injustice. She was a leader, a mentor, and a force for change. As the evening wound down, Sarah walked through the quiet streets of her neighborhood, the cool night air wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. The shadows that had once loomed so large over her life had begun to fade, replaced by the bright collective light of hope, resilience, and unity. And as Sarah looked toward the horizon, she knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice was far from over. But she and her community were ready for whatever came next. Thank you for following Sarah's powerful journey as she turned injustice into hope and resilience for herself and her community. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more content about justice, courage, and the power of community action. Join us as we continue to explore stories that remind us how one voice can make a difference. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Maya's name was now known nationwide, and the attention wasn't always positive. There were online trolls who accused her of playing the race card or trying to cash in on her pregnancy. The negativity stung, but Maya reminded herself that her fight had never been about money or fame, it had been about justice. And she had achieved that. Through it all, Ethan remained by her side, offering his unwavering support. Their relationship had grown stronger in the months leading up to the trial, and now, with the legal battle behind them, they could finally look forward to the future. Maya was in her third trimester, and they had started preparing for the arrival of their baby, turning their small apartment into a cozy home for the family they were about to build. One afternoon, as Maya sat in the newly decorated nursery, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. The soft cream-colored walls and the mobile, above the crib decorated with little stars and clouds, felt like a symbol of the new chapter in her life. She had fought her battle, and now it was time to focus on what truly mattered: her family. As she ran her hand over her growing belly, she thought back to everything she had endured over the past year. The doubt, the fear, the humiliation, it had all been worth it. Not just because she had won, but because she had stood up for herself and for others. She had refused to be silenced, refused to let Eli Grayson strip her of her dignity. The future felt bright, and for the first time in a long while, Maya allowed herself to truly believe that everything would be okay. A few weeks after the trial, Maya stood on the porch of their apartment, watching the sun set over the city skyline. Ethan came out to join her, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his hands on her belly. "It's so peaceful here," he said softly. "Feels like a different world compared to a few months ago." Maya smiled, leaning into him. "It really does. Everything feels lighter." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "You fought like hell to get here. You deserve every bit of peace and happiness that comes your way." Just then, Maya felt a gentle kick from the baby, and she laughed, placing her hand over Ethan's. "Hez reminding me that we're not quite done with the journey yet." Ethan chuckled, his voice warm and full of love. "Well, whatever comes next, we'll handle it together." Maya turned to face him, her heart swelling with emotion. "We will. We've made it this far." As they stood together on the porch, the quiet hum of the city in the background, Maya felt a sense of wholeness she hadn't felt in a long time. She had faced one of the toughest battles of her life, and she had emerged stronger, more resilient, and ready for whatever came next. The baby kicked again, and Maya laughed softly. "He's going to be a fighter, just like his mom." Ethan smiled, pulling her close. "He's got a good role model." They stood like that for a long time, watching the sunset and holding on to each other, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Their fight was over, and now they had a future to build. Future filled with love, hope, and the strength they had earned through every challenge they had overcome. A few months after the baby was born, Maya sat on the porch of their new home, cradling her son in her arms. The legal battle was behind her, and life had finally settled into a peaceful rhythm. She had left Grayson Corp., but the victory in court had opened doors she hadn't even imagined. Several companies had reached out to offer her positions, eager to have someone of her courage and integrity on their team. But for now, Maya was content to focus on her family. She had earned this time to be with her son, to enjoy the simple moments of motherhood that she had once feared she wouldn't get to experience. As the sun set on another day, Maya smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The fight had been hard, but it had been worth it. She had stood up, fought back, and won not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever been told she wasn't enough. She kissed the top of her baby's head, breathing in the sweet, familiar scent. The future was bright, and she was ready for whatever came next. Vanessa wiped her tears and took a deep breath. "We can't do it alone, Ethan. We need to lean on each other more. We need to take care of the girls, take care of ourselves. Well, keep fighting, but we have to find a way to do it without losing ourselves in the process." Ethan nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. "You're right. We'll find a way." That night, for the first time in weeks, Ethan and Vanessa made a conscious decision to step back from the fight, at least for a little while. They spent the evening with Jasmine and Chloe, watching movies, playing board games, and trying to create a sense of normalcy in the midst of the chaos. For a few hours, the weight of the lawsuit and the public scrutiny lifted, and the Carters were just a family again. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a starter reminder of what they were fighting for and why they couldn't give up. After their emotional confrontation, Ethan and Vanessa committed to finding a better balance between their fight for justice and the emotional well-being of their family. They began scheduling time each day to focus solely on Jasmine and Chloe, setting aside the demands of the lawsuit and media for those moments when they could just be a family again. Jasmine, ever the high achiever, struggled with the idea of stepping back from her intense focus on proving herself. But after a heartfelt conversation with her parents, she began to realize that her worth wasn't tied to the expectations of Brookwood or society at large. "I feel like I have to keep proving that I belong," Jasmine admitted one afternoon, sitting with Ethan and Vanessa in the backyard. Like if I let up for even a second, people will think I don't deserve to be here. Vanessa placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Jasmine, you've already proven that 1,000 times over. You don't have to carry that weight alone. The people who doubt you are wrong, not you. Don't let their narrow views dictate how you see yourself. Ethan nodded in agreement. You belong, Jasmine. Not because of what you've done, but because of who you are. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Chloe, who had been sitting quietly next to her sister, finally spoke up. I just wish it didn't feel like such a battle. I wish we didn't have to fight so hard just to be seen. Ethan's heart ached at his younger daughter's words. He had always known that the world was unfair, but hearing the pain in Chloe's voice made the injustice even more personal. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. I know, baby. I wish the same thing, he said softly. But we're changing things, little by little. Every time we stand up, every time we push back, we're making it easier for the next person who comes after us. Chloe leaned into her father, feeling the warmth of his embrace. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of safety, knowing that her family was there for her no matter what. As the days went on, the Carters found small ways to heal. They took walks together, had family dinners, and spent time laughing and talking about things other than the lawsuit. Slowly, the tension that had been suffocating them began to lift, and they rediscovered the joy in being together as a family. But even as they healed, they knew that the fight was far from over. The lawsuit loomed large, and the media continued to follow their every move. Still, they were stronger now, more united than ever, and ready to face whatever came next. With their family back on more solid ground, the Carters refocused on the legal battle ahead. Armed with the emails from Emily Henderson and the growing public support for their case, they were ready to take the next step, bringing the evidence to light in court. Vanessa and her legal team filed the emails as part of their discovery process, making them public as they prepared for trial. The documents were explosive, revealing Brookwood Academy's discriminatory practices in black and white terms. The school's legal team had no choice but to acknowledge the gravity of the evidence, and the public's reaction was swift and furious. News outlets ran headlines like leaked emails, show racism at elite private school, and Brookwood Academy caught in discrimination scandal. Social media erupted with calls for the resignation of Mr. Graham and other school leaders, and the pressure on the school's administration intensified. Protests outside the school grew larger, with civil rights groups joining forces to demand accountability. Parents of current students began to withdraw their children from the school, unwilling to be associated with an institution tainted by racism. Donors, too, started pulling their funding, threatening Brookwood's financial stability. Mr. Graham, who had once seemed untouchable, was now on the verge of losing everything. Inside the school, teachers and staff were growing increasingly uneasy, and whispers of a potential leadership change were circulating. The school board, divided for weeks, was now leaning toward taking drastic action to save the school's reputation. At a pivotal board meeting, Emily Henderson made her case once again. "We can't continue to ignore this," she said, her voice firm but measured. "The evidence is clear. We need to admit fault, settle the lawsuit, and start making real changes. If we don't, Brookwood won't survive." The other board members, who had been reluctant to take such a step, finally seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Even Dr. Harold Brown, who had staunchly defended the school's traditional values, remained silent, his resistance worn down by the undeniable truth. As the board voted to settle the lawsuit and initiate a complete overhaul of the school's admissions policies, the tide had officially turned. Brookwood Academy would never be the same again. In the weeks following the board's decision to settle the lawsuit, Brookwood Academy underwent a dramatic transformation. The first and most significant change came with the resignation of Mr. Graham, who was quietly removed from his position as headmaster. Publicly, the school framed it as a retirement, but everyone knew the truth: he had been forced out in disgrace. The board appointed Professor Emily Henderson as interim headmistress, a clear sign that the school was serious about reform. Her first act was to hold a series of town hall meetings with parents, students, and faculty to discuss the changes that were coming. She made it clear that Brookwood was committed to rebuilding its reputation by creating a more inclusive and equitable environment. Jasmine and Chloe, who had been following the developments closely, were invited back to Brookwood as part of the settlement. But it wasn't just about getting them back into the school, it was about making sure the changes were real and lasting. "I want to make sure this isn't just a PR move," Jasmine said during a family discussion. "I don't want to go back to a school that's only pretending to change." Vanessa nodded. "Well, make sure of that. Well, hold them accountable." Chloe, who had been quieter throughout the process, finally spoke up. "I want to go back, but I want it to be different. I want to feel like we belong." Ethan smiled softly at his daughters. "You will. You've earned your place, and you'll help shape the future of that school." As Brookwood implemented new policies, revising its admissions criteria, creating diversity and inclusion programs, and recruiting students from a wider range of backgrounds, Jasmine and Chloe became part of a new chapter in the school's history. They returned to Brookwood not just as students, but as symbols of change. The internal struggle within the school wasn't over, though. There were still those who resisted the changes, parents and alumni who clung to the old ways. But the tide had shifted, and Brookwood was on a path to becoming a more inclusive institution. For the Carters, the journey had been long and difficult, but they had emerged stronger, both as a family and as advocates for justice. They had fought not just for their daughters, but for every student who had ever been denied a seat at the table. As the court date approached, the anticipation weighed heavily on the Carter family. The lawsuit had garnered national attention, and the pressure was immense. The trial wasn't just about Jasmine and Chloe anymore, had become a defining moment in the fight for racial justice in education. Vanessa, who had been working tirelessly with their legal team, was ready for battle. She had rehearsed every point, every argument, and had poured herself into preparing for the trial. It wasn't just personal for her as a mother, as a lawyer. This case was her chance to set a legal precedent that would affect schools across the country. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Journalists, activists, and legal experts filled the gallery, while outside, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Equality for all and end racial discrimination in schools." It was clear that the outcome of this case would have far-reaching consequences. Jasmine and Chloe sat quietly beside their parents, their faces tense but determined. They had both insisted on being present, knowing that this fight was as much theirs as it was their parents'. They were nervous, but they were ready. The trial began with opening statements from both sides. Thomas Aldridge, Brookwood Academy's lead attorney, spoke first. His tone was polished and measured as he outlined the school's defense, carefully avoiding any direct mention of race. Instead, he framed the case around the school's right to maintain its standards and values, using vague language to distance the administration from any accusations of bias. "This case is not about discrimination," Aldridge said, his voice steady as he addressed the jury. "This case is about the right of a private institution to make decisions based on a holistic evaluation of each student." Brookwood Academy has, for decades, prided itself on creating a balanced and inclusive environment. The plaintiff's accusations are based on misinterpretation and personal grievance, not fact. Vanessa sat quietly, her face unreadable. She had expected Brookwood's legal team to sidestep the real issue and cloak their discrimination in the guise of academic standards. When it was her turn to speak, Vanessa rose, her presence commanding. She addressed the court with the same intensity she had brought to every legal battle of her career. But this time, there was something deeper, a mother's fierce resolve to protect her children. "This case," Vanessa began, her voice clear and strong, "is not about academic standards or maintaining school values. It's about race. It's about exclusion. It's about a system that has long operated under the guise of neutrality while quietly upholding practices designed to keep people like my daughters out. The evidence will show that Brookwood Academy did not reject Jasmine and Chloe Carter because they failed to meet academic requirements. They were rejected because they did not fit into the school's narrow definition of who belongs. Vanessa's words hung in the air as the courtroom fell silent, the weight of her accusations sinking in. Over the next several days, the trial unfolded with testimony from both sides. The Carters' legal team presented the leaked emails from Emily Henderson, which clearly revealed the discriminatory conversations between Brookwood's headmaster and the admissions committee. The emails showed how phrases like cultural fit and maintaining our identity were used to justify the exclusion of students of color. Emily Henderson herself took the stand, testifying about the discussions she had witnessed during her time on the board. Her testimony was a turning point in the trial. She described in detail how Mr. Graham had led the effort to push out Jasmine and Chloe, fearing backlash from wealthy conservative donors. "I joined Brookwood's board to help modernize the school," Emily said, her voice steady but emotional. "But I quickly realized that the administration was more interested in maintaining the status quo than in promoting diversity and inclusion." When Jasmine and Chloe Carter were admitted, there were immediate concerns about how their presence would fit with the school's existing community. These concerns had nothing to do with their academic qualifications and everything to do with their race. Aldridge tried to discredit Emily's testimony, suggesting that she was biased because of her progressive views, but it was clear that her words had struck a chord. The jury listened intently, and the mood in the courtroom shifted. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and arguments from both sides, the trial reached its final day. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury prepared to deliver their verdict. The Carters sat together, their hands intertwined, bracing for whatever was to come. The jury foreman stood and addressed the court. "In the case of Carter versus Brookwood Academy, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiffs." There was a collective gasp in the courtroom as the words sank in. The Carters had won. Tears filled Vanessa's eyes as she squeezed Ethan's hand. Jasmine and Chloe, who had remained stoic throughout the trial, finally let out the breath they had been holding. It was over. They had won. The jury found that Brookwood Academy had indeed engaged in discriminatory practices and had violated Jasmine and Chloe's right to an equal education. The school was ordered to pay damages to the Carters, but more importantly, they were required to make immediate changes to their admissions policies, ensuring that no student would ever again be rejected based on race. The media erupted with the news. Headlines declared the Carters' victory as a landmark case in the fight against racial discrimination in private education. Civil rights groups hailed the decision as a major step forward, and parents across the country began to look more closely at the policies of their children's schools. Outside the courthouse, a large crowd had gathered. Supporters cheered as the Carter family emerged, holding their heads high. Ethan addressed the crowd, his voice filled with pride and emotion. "This victory is not just for my daughters," Ethan said, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "This is for every student who has ever been told they don't belong because of the color of their skin. This is for every family who has had to fight just to be seen, just to be heard. We are not done fighting, but today we take a step forward. Today justice was served." The crowd roared in response, and Jasmine and Chloe smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. They had fought hard, and now they could finally begin to heal. In the wake of the verdict, Brookwood Academy faced a reckoning unlike anything it had experienced in its long history. The school's reputation had been severely damaged by the trial, and Mr. Graham's resignation was not enough to stem the tide of criticism. Under the leadership of Emily Henderson, who had been appointed as the new headmistress following the verdict, Brookwood began to make the changes mandated by the court. Emily wasted no time in overhauling the admissions process, removing the vague cultural fit criteria that had been used to discriminate against students of color. In its place, she implemented new policies designed to ensure transparency and fairness, with a focus on promoting diversity and inclusion. But it wasn't just the admissions process that needed reform. Brookwood's culture had to change as well. Emily worked with faculty and students to create programs that would foster a more inclusive environment, where all students, regardless of race, felt welcome and valued. She introduced workshops on racial bias and privilege, brought in guest speakers from diverse backgrounds, and encouraged open discussions about race and equity. For some members of the Brookwood community, these changes were long overdue. Teachers who had quietly supported the Carters throughout the trial were finally able to speak out, sharing their own experiences of witnessing discrimination at the school. Parents who had been hesitant to get involved in the controversy now voiced their support for the new direction the school was taking. But not everyone was on board. A vocal minority of parents and alumni resisted the changes, claiming that Brookwood was abandoning its traditions in favor of political correctness. Some families withdrew their children from the school, and a few of the school's wealthiest donors cut off their financial support in protest. Despite these challenges, Emily remained steadfast. She knew that real change would take time, but she was determined to lead Brookwood into a new era where every student, regardless of background, had an equal opportunity to succeed. As for Mr. Graham, his departure from Brookwood was swift and quiet. He had once been a powerful figure in the world of elite education, but the trial had tarnished his reputation beyond repair. He retired from public life, leaving behind a legacy of exclusion and prejudice that Brookwood was now working to undo. The day finally came when Jasmine and Chloe would return to Brookwood Academy. It was a day they had both anticipated and dreaded in equal measure. The school was different now. There were new faces, new policies, and a new atmosphere of openness, but it was still the same place where they had been rejected, where they had felt like outsiders. As they walked through the gates hand in hand, Jasmine and Chloe were met with curious glances from their peers. Some students smiled, offering tentative waves of welcome. Others, the ones who had always seen them as outsiders, looked away, unwilling to acknowledge the change that had come to Brookwood. But Jasmine and Chloe didn't let the stares or the whispers deter them. They walked into the building with their heads held high, knowing that they had earned their place here, not just because of their academic achievements, but because of the fight they had won. The first few weeks were challenging. Jasmine, always driven, threw herself back into her studies, determined to succeed on her own terms. Chloe, still more reserved, found solace in her art classes, where she could express the emotions she had been carrying for so long. Both girls had moments of doubt, moments where they wondered if they would ever truly feel at home at Brookwood. But slowly, as the school adjusted to its new reality, they began to find their footing. Teachers, many of whom had quietly supported the Carters throughout their ordeal, went out of their way to make sure Jasmine and Chloe felt included. Fellow students who had once been distant now reached out, inviting them to study groups and extracurricular activities. Bit by bit, the school began to feel less like a battleground and more like a place where they could thrive. One afternoon, as Jasmine and Chloe were leaving school, they stopped by the newly created Diversity and Inclusion Office, which had been established as part of the school's reforms. Inside, they saw a group of younger students, Black, Latino, Asian, gathered around a table, discussing ideas for a new student-led initiative to promote equity at Brookwood. Jasmine smiled as she watched them. She turned to Chloe, her voice filled with quiet pride. "This is why we fought. So they wouldn't have to." Chloe nodded, her eyes softening. "Yeah, we did it." As they walked out of the building, the sun setting behind them, the weight of the past year finally began to lift. They had faced unimaginable challenges, but they had emerged stronger, not just for themselves, but for the students who would come after them. Months after the trial, Ethan sat in his office, reflecting on the journey his family had been through. The fight had been long and grueling, but they had won. And while the victory in court had been important, it was the deeper, more personal victories that meant the most to him. He thought about Jasmine and Chloe, how they had grown into strong, resilient young women over the course of the battle. He thought about Vanessa, who had fought alongside him every step of the way, balancing her roles as lawyer, mother, and advocate with grace and determination. He thought about the moments when it had seemed like they might lose everything, but somehow they had found the strength to keep going. As a senator, Ethan had always believed in the power of the law to bring about change. But this case had taught him something deeper, that real change comes not just from legal victories, but from the courage to stand up and say, "This is wrong, and we won't accept it." He knew that their fight wasn't over. The issues they had faced at Brookwood were just a small part of the larger system of inequality that permeated society. But their victory had shown that change was possible, that the system could be challenged, and that families like his could make a difference. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. They had won one battle, but there were many more to fight. And with his family by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. The Carter family's victory in court had sent shockwaves through the country, igniting conversations about racial inequality and systemic discrimination in education. The case had become a touchstone for civil rights activists, educators, and families who had experienced similar discrimination in other schools. It wasn't long before other institutions began to face scrutiny, with families stepping forward to challenge discriminatory practices at private and public schools alike. The Carter case had not only reshaped Brookwood Academy, but it had also sparked a movement. Across social media, hashtags like Justice for All Students and Equal Education for All trended for weeks, with thousands of people sharing their stories of exclusion and discrimination. Civil rights organizations used the momentum to push for new policies that would address racial disparities in schools nationwide. Ethan, who had always been a vocal advocate for equal rights, was now thrust into the national spotlight. As a senator, his platform had expanded, and he used it to champion legislative reform aimed at dismantling systemic barriers in education. He proposed a bill that would mandate stricter oversight of private school admissions processes, ensuring transparency and preventing discrimination based on race, socioeconomic status, or other factors. "This is just the beginning," Ethan said during a televised interview, his voice resolute. "We've taken a step forward, but we have a long way to go. Every child deserves an equal opportunity to succeed, no matter where they come from or what they look like. We won't stop fighting until that's a reality." The bill gained traction in Congress, with bipartisan support from lawmakers who recognized the importance of addressing inequality in education. Ethan found himself working closely with civil rights leaders, community organizers, and fellow politicians to build a coalition that would push the bill forward. Meanwhile, Vanessa was also making an impact. As a high-profile lawyer with expertise in discrimination cases, she became a sought-after speaker at conferences and legal forums where she discussed the implications of the Carter case and the need for ongoing legal reform. She received invitations to speak at law schools where students were eager to learn from her experience and insight. "I've always believed that the law is a tool for justice," Vanessa said during one such event. "But it's only as powerful as the people who wield it. We have to keep pushing, keep fighting, and keep using the law to hold institutions accountable." The Carter case wasn't just a win for my family, it was a win for every family that has ever faced discrimination. For Jasmine and Chloe, the ripple effect of their case was deeply personal. They began receiving messages from students all over the country, many of whom shared their own experiences of feeling like outsiders in predominantly white institutions. Jasmine, in particular, felt a responsibility to respond to these messages, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. One day, Jasmine received a letter from a young girl in Texas who had been rejected from a prestigious private school under similar circumstances. The girl wrote about how she had been told she didn't fit the culture of the school, despite her academic qualifications. She had felt defeated, but after reading about the Carter case, she decided to fight back. "Your story gave me the courage to stand up for myself," the girl wrote. "Thank you for showing me that I deserve a place at the table, no matter what anyone says." Jasmine was moved to tears as she read the letter. She realized that their fight hadn't just been for themselves, it had been for every student who had ever been told they didn't belong. And now, those students were finding their voices and pushing back against the system. At Brookwood Academy, the changes initiated by Emily Henderson continued to transform the school. With new policies in place, the admissions process became more transparent, and the focus shifted toward building a truly inclusive community. The school's Diversity and Inclusion Office, created in the wake of the lawsuit, became a central hub for student-led initiatives aimed at promoting equity and addressing bias. One of the first major changes was the formation of a student advisory board, which included representatives from different racial, cultural, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Jasmine and Chloe were invited to join the board, and while they were initially hesitant, they saw it as an opportunity to help shape the future of Brookwood. The first meeting of the advisory board was filled with nervous energy as students from different grades and backgrounds gathered to discuss their visions for the school. Jasmine, who had always been more outspoken, took the lead, while Chloe offered her quiet but insightful input. "We need to make sure that the changes we're making aren't just on paper," Jasmine said during the meeting. "It's not enough to change the admissions process. We need to change the way people think. We need to create a culture where everyone feels like they belong, no matter who they are." The other students nodded in agreement, and soon the conversation flowed freely, with ideas for workshops, cultural events, and mentorship programs aimed at fostering understanding and unity within the student body. Under Emily's leadership, Brookwood also began reaching out to communities that had been historically underrepresented at the school. They partnered with local organizations to recruit students from diverse backgrounds and provided scholarships to ensure that financial barriers wouldn't prevent deserving students from attending. Emily herself worked tirelessly to rebuild trust within the Brookwood community. She held regular town hall meetings with parents and faculty, where she addressed concerns and shared updates on the school's progress. She made it clear that Brookwood was committed to becoming a leader in educational equity. And while some parents remained resistant, the majority embraced the changes. One afternoon, as Jasmine and Chloe were leaving school, they stopped to talk with Emily, who was walking across the campus. "You've both done so much to help make these changes happen," Emily said, her voice warm with admiration. "Brookwood is better because of you." Jasmine smiled, feeling a sense of pride. "It wasn't just us. A lot of people fought to make this happen." "True," Emily replied, "but you were the spark that ignited the change." As Jasmine and Chloe walked away, they reflected on how far they had come. They had once felt like outsiders, unsure of their place at Brookwood, but now they were part of something much bigger, a movement toward a more just and inclusive future. While Brookwood Academy was undergoing a transformation, the Carter family was focused on rebuilding trust, both within their own family and in the community. The emotional toll of the lawsuit and the public scrutiny had been immense, but now that the battle was behind them, they were beginning to heal. Ethan and Vanessa, who had always been a strong team, took time to reconnect with each other and with their daughters. They made a conscious effort to spend more time together as a family, away from the pressures of their respective careers. Weekend trips, family dinners, and quiet evenings at home became a regular part of their routine. For Jasmine and Chloe, the process of rebuilding trust within themselves was more personal. The past year had tested their resilience, but it had also taught them important lessons about their own strength and the power of their voices. Jasmine, who had always felt the need to prove herself academically, began to let go of the idea that her worth was tied to her achievements. She realized that her place at Brookwood wasn't something she had to justify, it was something she had earned. She also started to explore her interests outside of academics, joining the school's debate team and getting involved in student government. Chloe, who had struggled with anxiety and self-doubt, found solace in her art. She began to use her creativity as an outlet for her emotions, expressing through painting and drawing what she couldn't always put into words. Her art teacher noticed her talent and encouraged her to showcase her work in the school's annual art exhibit. "I didn't think anyone would want to see my stuff," Chloe admitted one afternoon, as she showed her parents one of her latest paintings. Vanessa smiled, admiring the vibrant colors and intricate details of Chloe's work. "Your art is beautiful, Chloe. You have a gift, and the world deserves to see it." With her parents' encouragement, Chloe agreed to submit her work to the exhibit. On the day of the event, as students and parents wandered through the gallery, Chloe watched nervously from the sidelines, unsure of how her art would be received. But as people stopped to admire her paintings, offering compliments, and asking about her process, she felt a sense of validation she hadn't expected. One of the visitors to the exhibit was Professor Reynolds, the board member who had supported the changes at Brookwood. He paused in front of one of Chloe's paintings, studying it carefully. "This is remarkable," he said, turning to Chloe with a smile. "You have a real talent." Chloe blushed, feeling both proud and shy at the same time. "Thank you. It means a lot." As the evening went on, Chloe realized that she had found her place not just as a student at Brookwood, but as an artist with a voice of her own. The Carter family had been through a storm, but they had come out stronger on the other side. With the lawsuit behind them and Brookwood Academy on a new path, they were ready to focus on what mattered most to each other. One summer evening, the family gathered in their backyard for a barbecue, a tradition they had started before the chaos of the lawsuit had consumed their lives. The smell of grilled food filled the air as they laughed and talked, enjoying the simple pleasure of being together. Jasmine and Chloe sat on the patio, reminiscing about their first day at Brookwood and how much had changed since then. "I never thought we'd get through all of that," Jasmine said, sipping lemonade. "But here we are." Chloe nodded, her eyes softening. "I'm glad we didn't give up. It was hard, but we made it." Ethan joined them, holding a plate of burgers and hot dogs. He smiled at his daughters, pride radiating from him. "You two are the strongest people I know. You fought for what was right, and you made a difference." Vanessa, carrying a bowl of salad, sat down beside Ethan. She placed a hand on his arm, her expression filled with love and gratitude. "We all made a difference, and we did it together." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the backyard, the Carters sat around the table eating and laughing. The weight of the past year finally lifted. They knew that there would always be challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them together. That night, as Jasmine and Chloe sat outside, looking up at the stars, they reflected on how far they had come. They had been tested in ways they never could have imagined, but they had emerged stronger, more confident, and more certain of their place in the world. "I think we're going to be okay," Chloe said softly, her gaze fixed on the sky. Jasmine smiled, her heart full. "Yeah, we're going to be just fine." Months after the lawsuit had ended, the Carter family continued to move forward, both personally and professionally. Ethan's proposed bill on educational reform was gaining momentum in Congress, with support from lawmakers across the political spectrum. The bill aimed to establish nationwide guidelines for private school admissions, ensuring that no student would be discriminated against based on race, socioeconomic status, or background. On the day of the vote, Ethan stood in the Senate chamber, addressing his colleagues with the same passion that had driven him throughout the Brookwood case. "This bill is about fairness," he said, his voice steady but powerful. "It's about giving every child a fair shot at success. It's about ensuring that no student is ever told they don't belong because of the color of their skin. We've come a long way, but we still have work to do. And it starts here, with this bill." As the vote was cast, the bill passed with overwhelming support, marking a major victory in the fight for educational equity. Ethan, standing in the Senate chamber, allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. The fight was far from over, but this was a step in the right direction. Meanwhile, Vanessa continued to work on cases related to racial discrimination, using her platform to advocate for families facing similar challenges. She became a mentor to young lawyers, sharing her knowledge and experience to help them navigate the complexities of civil rights law. For Jasmine and Chloe, life at Brookwood had settled into a new normal. They continued to thrive academically, but they also made time for the things they loved: debating, painting, and building friendships with students from all walks of life. One afternoon, as the sisters sat in the school library, Chloe looked up from her sketchbook and smiled at Jasmine. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't fought back?" Chloe asked. Jasmine thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't like to think about that. What matters is that we did fight, and because of that, everything changed." Chloe nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "We should be proud of that." "We are," Jasmine said, her voice filled with certainty. "We made a difference." As the sisters packed up their things and headed out of the library, They knew that their fight had been worth it. They had faced adversity and come out stronger, and they had helped pave the way for a future where every student, regardless of race or background, could walk through the doors of opportunity with their head held high. The road ahead was long, but the Carters were ready for it. Thank you so much for following the Carter family's journey to justice and equality. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about powerful narratives that challenge society, inspire change, and explore the human experience, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss out on new content. Together, we can continue to share stories that matter. See you in the next one. The police are on their way, Derek. You've lost. Derek's eyes darted around, realizing for the first time that the entire street was watching him. His bravado faltered, his shoulders tensing as he took in the growing crowd of neighbors, all standing together in a show of solidarity. For a moment, it seemed like Derek might lash out, might do something reckless. But then slowly, the fight drained out of him. His fists unclenched, his shoulders slumped, and with one last look at Edith filled with hatred and resentment, he turned and stormed back to his car. The street was silent as Derek sped away, his tires screeching against the pavement. Edith's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She stood there for a moment, frozen, until Bill crossed the street and stood beside her. "You okay, Edith?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Edith nodded, though her legs still felt shaky. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to all of you." Bill smiled warmly, giving her a reassuring nod. "We're not going to let him hurt you, Edith. Not now, not ever." Edith's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of gratitude. She had been afraid for so long, but now, standing here with her neighbors by her side, she felt a renewed sense of strength. She wasn't alone. In the days following the final confrontation with Derek, the neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the sense of fear that had once gripped Cedar Street began to dissipate. Derek hadn't returned, and Edith had received word from the police that he was being closely monitored. They had issued a restraining order, preventing Derek from coming within a certain distance of Edith's home or the shelter where Rachel and the girls were staying. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to give Edith peace of mind for now. Rachel called regularly, checking in to see how Edith was doing and updating her on their progress. The shelter had helped her find legal representation, and she was working towards securing full custody of the girls and filing for divorce from Derek. It was a long, difficult road, but Rachel was determined to keep moving forward. "The girls are adjusting," Rachel said during one phone call, her voice sounding stronger, more confident. "They're starting to sleep better, and we're getting used to our new routine. It's still hard sometimes, but I feel like we're finally free." Edith smiled, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel. She had come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, Edith knew that Rachel had the strength to face them. "I'm so proud of you," Edith said softly. "You're doing such a good job, Rachel. You and the girls are going to be just fine." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then her voice softened. "We couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You saved us. I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done." Tears welled in Edith's eyes, and she wiped them away with a smile. "You're family now, Rachel, and family takes care of each other." As Edith hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over her. She had faced her fears, stood up to Derek, and helped Rachel and the girls escape a dangerous situation. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Her home, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. And her neighbors, once strangers, had become a community, united by a shared sense of purpose. Life on Cedar Street would never be the same again, but that was okay. Because now it is filled with hope, connection, and the promise of a better future. Edith smiled as she stepped out into her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the roses. She knelt down, her hands gently tending to the flowers, feeling the cool earth beneath her fingertips. There was still work to be done, but now she knew she wasn't doing it alone. In the weeks that followed Derek's final confrontation, a new sense of peace settled over Cedar Street. The neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the need for constant worry had lessened as Derek's presence faded from their lives. He hadn't returned, and the restraining order kept him at a safe distance from Edith's home and from the shelter where Rachel and the girls were living. Edith found herself breathing easier with each passing day, the weight of fear slowly lifting from her shoulders. One crisp autumn morning, as Edith was pruning her roses, she heard the familiar ring of her phone from inside the house. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron and hurried to answer it, her heart lifting when she saw Rachel's name on the caller ID. "Rachel, it's so good to hear from you," Edith said, a smile spreading across her face as she held the phone to her ear. "Hi, Edith," Rachel replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, dear. Just tending to the garden. How are you and the girls doing?" Rachel let out a small sigh, though it was one of relief rather than stress. "We're doing really well, actually. The girls are starting to settle in at school, and they're making new friends. We've been staying at the shelter for a while now, but I've been working with a caseworker. And, well, we found a place. It's a small apartment, but it's ours." Edith's heart swelled with joy at the news. "Rachel, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I couldn't have done it without your help, Edith." "Really? I mean it. You were there for me when I didn't know what to do. I'll never be able to thank you enough." "You've already thanked me more than enough, Rachel," Edith said gently. "I'm just glad you and the girls are safe and moving forward." "We are," Rachel agreed, her voice steady. "We still have some hard days, but we're starting to rebuild. I'm learning how to live without looking over my shoulder all the time. The girls, they've been through so much, but I think they're going to be okay." Edith felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a smile. "You're an incredible mother, Rachel. You've given them the chance to have a better life, and that's the most important thing." "Thank you," Rachel whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I wanted to ask, would you like to come visit us when we're settled into the apartment? The girls miss you, and I'd love for you to see our new place." "I'd love that," Edith replied without hesitation. "I can't wait to see how far you've come." After they said their goodbyes, Edith stood in the quiet of her kitchen, a deep sense of pride and peace settling over her. She had been part of something important, helping Rachel and her daughters escape a dangerous situation and start a new life. Knowing that they were safe and thriving gave Edith a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. But Edith also knew that healing wasn't just for Rachel and the girls. She, too, had been deeply affected by everything that had happened. For so long, Edith had lived in a world of solitude, wrapped in the memories of her past life with Richard. But now she realized that she had the power to create new connections, to make a difference in the lives of others. Her small, quiet world had expanded in ways she never could have predicted. A few weeks later, Edith stood in front of the door to Rachel's new apartment, her heart racing with anticipation. She held a basket filled with homemade cookies and a small potted plant, a housewarming gift for Rachel and the girls. As she knocked on the door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and pride. Rachel had taken such brave steps toward building a new life for herself and her daughters, and Edith was eager to see the progress they had made. The door opened, and there stood Rachel, her face lighting up with a wide smile. "Edith, you made it." "Of course I did," Edith replied warmly, stepping inside and hugging Rachel. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the warmth and light that Edith had come to associate with Rachel. The walls were adorned with colorful artwork, some drawn by Lily and Ivy, and the space felt alive with the energy of a family building something new. Edith smiled as she took it all in, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel's resilience. "Look who's here!" Rachel called out. And moments later, Lily and Ivy came bounding into the room, their faces bright with excitement. "Grandma Edith!" they exclaimed in unison, rushing toward her and wrapping their arms around her. Edith laughed, bending down to hug the girls. "Oh, my dears, it's so good to see you." "We missed you," Ivy said, her voice small but filled with warmth. "Can you stay for dinner?" "I wouldn't dream of leaving before dinner," Edith replied, her heart swelling with affection for the girls. As they settled into the living room, Rachel brought out a pot of tea and the four of them spent the afternoon catching up, laughing, and sharing stories. The girls proudly showed Edith their artwork, and Rachel talked about how they were adjusting to their new school and making friends. "They're doing so well," Rachel said, her voice filled with relief and pride. "I wasn't sure how they would handle all the changes, but they've been so strong. I'm so proud of them." "You should be proud of yourself too," Edith said gently. "You've created a safe, loving home for them. That's everything." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. "I still can't believe we made it. There were times when I thought we'd never get out, but now we have a chance at a real life." As the afternoon turned into evening, the conversation grew deeper, and Edith and Rachel found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. There had been so much pain, fear, and uncertainty, but now there was also hope. They had made it through the storm, and now they were standing on the other side, ready to rebuild their lives. "I never thought I'd feel free," Rachel admitted quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "But now I wake up every morning knowing that I'm safe, that my girls are safe. And that's everything." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve this peace, Rachel. You and the girls deserve all the happiness in the world." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And you deserve it too, Edith. You've been through so much yourself. You've given us a new start, and I hope you know how much that means to me." Edith smiled, her heart full. "We've given each other a new start." Later that evening, after dinner, and one last round of hugs from Lily and Ivy, Edith said her goodbyes and made her way back to her own home. As she walked down the quiet street, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but it was better, now richer, fuller, and filled with new connections. Rachel and the girls had become like family to her, and Edith knew that their bond would only grow stronger as they continued to support one another in the days ahead. As the autumn leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, Edith found herself spending more time in her garden, reflecting on the past few months. So much had changed, not just for Rachel and the girls, but for Edith as well. Her life, once quiet and isolated, had been transformed by the relationships she had built and the strength she had discovered within herself. But with that transformation came a deeper understanding of the weight she had been carrying for so long: grief, the loneliness, the sense of being left behind. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.